Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining me. In this video, I'll be discussing language endangerment. First, I'll address the severity of the language endangerment crisis around the world, then I'll talk about some of the causes of language endangerment, and finally, I'll argue why everyone should care. Let's get started. Did you know there are an estimated 7,000 spoken and signed languages around the world, but 5,000 of those have fewer than 100,000 speakers? In fact, according to Gregory Anderson and David Harrison, 96% of the world's languages are spoken by just 4% of the world's population. This means that there are just a handful of languages that have a monopoly over the world's communication systems. Consider the Quechuan languages. This is the most widely spoken indigenous language family in the Americas, collectively having around 7 million speakers among these Quechuan languages. That might sound like a really large number, so you might think that these languages are under no threat. However, unfortunately, indigenous languages like Quechua are no longer being passed down to children as a first language, and ultimately, it only takes one generation of disruption to destabilize a language. So one generation may view the future of its language as guaranteed, only to witness its disappearance a few decades later. So just how severe is the language endangerment crisis around the world? Well, according to UNESCO, around 3,000 languages could disappear by the end of this century, at a rate of one every 2 weeks. That's alarming. In fact, of the estimated 7,000 languages that are used today, the overwhelming vast majority of them are indigenous and under threat because of their indigenous status. Now, an indigenous language is so called because it is used by a group of people who have essentially occupied the same territory for a long time and are likely first inhabitants of that area. These days, unfortunately, indigenous groups tend to be smaller and possess less power and access to resources than the dominant group or groups that may border or even surround them. This means that indigenous peoples, they encounter a number of pressures and forces that are exerted upon them which affect the vitality of their languages. So what are these forces and pressures? Why do languages disappear? Well, there are a number of reasons, and many of them may occur in conjunction with others. Perhaps the first cause that we should mention is genocide. Now, obviously, the large-scale destruction of an entire group of people, whether based on nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion, will have consequences for the language or languages used by that group of people. Second is the concept of cultural assimilation, or the forced activities and behaviors that were placed on marginalized groups. Perhaps the best example of this can be found in the establishment of Native American boarding schools from the 17th century through the early 20th century in the United States. And this is where children were forcibly removed from their families and home communities and brought to places like this, the infamous Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, where they were forced to adopt Western culture. Here, children's hair was cut short, they were forced to wear uniforms, given Western names, proselytized, and physically punished for speaking their native languages. The goal of the Carlisle School was summarized by its long-standing superintendent and supreme Richard Henry Pratt, who said, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Speakers of endangered languages also encounter a number of assimilatory pressures. For example, if you're a young Native American growing up in my home state of New Mexico, you would be lucky if your heritage language is even mentioned, let alone used on radio or television. And this is in a state like New Mexico where there's more linguistic diversity and tolerance compared to a lot of other states. Now, even if we put aside the fact that there is very little representation among endangered languages on social media, or even on the internet more generally, speakers of non-dominant languages must learn the language or languages of broader use to gain access to the dollar, if nothing else. After all, employers are, unfortunately, far more likely to speak English or Spanish rather than, say, Apache or Zuni. Related to assimilation and assimilatory pressures are the educational policies that affect speakers of endangered languages, and again, we don't have to look to the distant past to find examples. Consider the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001, which sought educational reform through an increased focus on standardized testing. Now, to be clear, I am not arguing that standards aren't good or that they're not necessary, because they are, but this specific piece of legislation emphasized proficiency in English at the expense of all other languages. It is perhaps tragic that linguists, like biologists, preside over the disappearance of their very object of inquiry. In the case of biologists, it's endangered species. In the case of linguists, it's endangered languages. But why should you care if you're not a linguist? Now, as you may have noticed, I am a white, English-speaking male, and this is a group that has traditionally enjoyed a lot of power and linguistic capital. So one could argue that I don't have the kind of ethos or credibility to speak on this topic. And while that may be true, and speaks to a broader issue of who should or should not speak on behalf of other groups of people, I would argue that people who look and speak like I do should care about the disappearance of languages for several reasons. Ultimately, the loss of a language, any language, involves the loss of different types of diversity. Now, when we lose a language, first, we lose part of an understanding of the great many ways that languages can differ in terms of their linguistic structure. In this sense, we lose precious data about what a language can look or sound like. Second, as a humanistic extension of this, we lose access to the cosmology of the speakers of that language. As I argued in my video on linguistic relativity, the language or languages you speak shapes the way that you view the world around you. In this sense, the loss of a language amounts to the loss of a unique worldview. So how do EAC speakers view the world around them based on the grammatical categories available in the EAC language? Well, we may never know because that language went dormant when the last native speaker passed away in 2008. Lastly, and in a more non-academic sense, when we lose a language, the world is just a little bit less interesting of a place. Sure, traveling around the world would be made easier if everyone spoke the same language, but how boring would that be? The rich cultural diversity that exists among peoples around the world is incredibly fascinating, and so much of that, in my view, is based on language difference. So when we lose a language, we're losing a unique piece of the human experience. Here, I find a useful analogy in a quote from a perhaps unexpected place, Morgan Freeman's character in Shawshank Redemption, who said, "Some birds aren't meant to be caged. Their feathers are just too bright. And when they fly away, the part of you that knows it was a sin to lock them up does rejoice. But still, the place you live in is that much more drab and empty that they're gone. I guess I just miss my friend." Okay, that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Take care.